Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
Content warning ahead. This podcast contains very sensitive topics such as missing persons, unsolved cases, haunted houses, and paranormal activity. These type of topics can contain very upsetting, sensitive details and stories. Please listen responsibly. Welcome to Misty Mysteries, a podcast in the business of ghostly spooks and chilling crimes. I'm your host, Keely, and any ad played before or after this episode do not reflect any of my personal beliefs. The only ads Misty Mystery has control over are host-read ones or promos from other podcasts. So, jumping into this week's episode. After the heaviness of last week's episode, I have a classic haunted house in store for you, and it's a much-needed change of pace. Except it's maybe one of the more terrifying haunted houses I will probably ever cover. In this episode, I'll be taking you to Union, Missouri to hear about the 13-day haunting of Steven Lachance and his 3 kids.
Hello and welcome to Once Upon a Nightmare, your horror movie podcast. I am your host Lorraine and I'm here to chat about the fictional horrors of the world with some real horror thrown in. So if I want that true crime fix, I can just find a film based on actual events and chat about that. Still a horror movie.
Loophole!
I have had what some would call an unhealthy obsession with the horrors of the world for well over 30 years now, real and fictional. So if any of that piques your interest, you can find me on your podcast platform of choice. And of course, don't forget to rate and review and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Bye.
In May of 2001, single father Steven Lachance was sharing a small apartment with his 3 children, and the lease of this small apartment was just about to come to an end. In a desperate need to probably get more space for the 4 of them and make sure his children had a place to lay their head at night, Steven began to search newspaper listings for rental properties and call around when he received a call from a woman who owned a house in Union, Missouri. She was renting out her home and invited Steven to come to its open house that Sunday. When Sunday rolled around, Steven attended this open house with his daughter. At the open house, they walked up to see a old, charming craftsman-style home. The small, charming white home had a porch lined with columns, and most importantly, it seemed a lot larger than the apartment the 4 of them were living in at the moment. When they stepped inside the home, they noticed that for its age, it had been well cared for, but featured some odd or unique things, like a cherub-covered wallpaper throughout the whole living room, a fruit cellar in the basement, and a butcher shower also in the basement. I personally don't think I ever heard of a butcher shower till now, but a butcher shower was a cement shower designed for washing animal blood off when butchers were done with their work. Pretty self-explanatory. I think if I saw something like that in a basement, it would definitely make me question the home and its history. But for Steven, he knew he needed a good home for his kids and decided to fill out a renter's application on the spot that Sunday. After he filled out his application, he handed it over to the owner of the home, and she asked him, "You understand the responsibility that comes with living in an old home such as this?" Steven, like many of us, thought that was kind of a strange question, but didn't think too much of it since she had acted as if this home was more of a museum than a rental property throughout this open house. Later that week, though, the Lachance family was chosen as the new tenants, and Steven signed the lease for this home right away. With their apartment lease ending and the new lease signed, Steven moved him, his daughter, and his 2 sons into the home on Memorial Day weekend of 2001. On day 1, living in the house, meaning move-in day, strange things started to happen to them. As Steven and the kids unpacked their moving van, a car drove past them very slowly. The person inside of the car rolled their window down and told the Lachance family, "Hope you get along here okay," before driving away from the home. Steven's daughter also noticed that the neighbors walking down the street would cross the street to avoid their new home. Then, to top off their move-in day, Steven noticed that the bedroom doors had latches on them, but instead of them being on the inside of the door for the person inside to lock them, they were on the outside of the door to lock someone or something inside. The family's experience in this home just kept getting more strange, and then just straight out terrifying for the 13 days they lived there. At first, the family experiences were electrical and light related. They said that they could feel electric currents running throughout the house, but when Steven hired an electrician to come out to fix the problem, the electrician found nothing wrong with the home's electrical systems. Then, bright lights would shine into the windows through the home throughout different times of the day and areas of the home. When the family would run outside to see what was happening, they could never find any source for this light. Then, whatever is in this home started to push past lights and electricity. When Steven started to try to make the house a home by hanging in pictures, the force in this home had a way different idea. While trying to hang up one picture in particular, Steven tried to secure it multiple times. Each time it would fall off of the wall. Then he witnessed the picture look like it jumped off the hook before crashing onto the floor. Next, doors in the home began to open and slam shut on their own, and in the natural order of a haunting like this, the entity in this home began to show itself. One of the Lachance boys would see a scary clown in the home with big red hair, plus screams would be heard throughout the house, as well as a deep growl from a man. Then when one of the Lachance boys was playing in the basement of the home, the one with the butcher shower, this entity of the home that Steven himself will later see in the butcher shower chased the boy out of the basement, scaring the boy so bad that he ended up peeing himself. When Steven asked him what this entity looked like, the boy told him, "I don't know, Daddy, but it was big." Steven seemed to be more on the safe side of these experiences, so he and his two other children, although I'm not too sure how safe it truly is to take children to do this, but they decided to look for an intruder in their basement that could have chased the young boy, but no one was found in the basement that night. Steven just assumed when he didn't find anything in the basement that the monster his son saw in the basement was just his imagination. At first, Steven probably thought he was right about his son's basement monster because the activity in this home could be hot and cold, but then, slowly, things started to kick up. For a whole week, even after the electrician had come out and gave them the all clear, they would come home to all the lights in the house being on. Steven would even make sure he turned the lights off before work, but it would still happen. The house suffered from very intense temperature changes. Steven's daughter would tell him that the house was freezing cold, but he would be covered in sweat from the heat. And given they lived in the house late May to early June, it was probably pretty warm outside. Now, Steven often tried to dismiss or debunk things like with the electric issues or the basement, since he was not a believer in the paranormal when they moved into the house. But this house made him a believer. I found a quote of his that said, "I was a true skeptic, a true disbeliever. Now I do believe. I wish I didn't. It would be easier for me to sleep at night." The experience that made him a believer in particular was when he finally saw the basement monster wasn't just his son's imagination. One night, Steven was talking to his 3 kids when he saw a dark gray mist behind them. This dark gray mist then morphed into the figure of a man. This ghostly figure stood where it appeared he was watching Steven and his kids, before slowly moving towards the family. Luckily, the entity disappeared before it could hurt or scare the children, but he knew he needed to get out of the house after this moment, and he needed to do it as soon as possible. Steven decided the best way to leave was calmly, even though he wanted to just run. He told his kids, "Let's go get soda and see Grandma." Steven tried to get his kids out of the house in a calm manner, but this entity had another idea, just like with the picture. As they were leaving the home, a man's long and loud scream filled the whole house, sending the family running for their car. As Steven drove off with his kids to Grandma's house where they spent the night, the son who had the encounter with the basement monster told his dad the basement monster was now staring out of the upstairs window. When Steven looked, he realized that the basement monster was this dark figure he saw standing behind his kids in the living room that night. As terrifying as this event was, I think most of us know it's not always easy to just break leases or find housing, especially as a single parent. So when Steven returned back to town after a business trip, they gave the home one more chance. Together, the family explored an old shed in the house's backyard, which they found filled with the personal belongings of the past tenants. Steven, like most of us, thought it was odd that so many people's personal belongings were still in the backyard of this house. So he decided to talk to the owner of the home about this and ask her about the home's history. According to my sources, the history of this home is a pretty dark one. The home, known as the Union Screaming House, this white, charming house, was built in 1932, but the land itself has a history of violence. The land was owned by a man named Captain T. Crow, and according to the legend of the land, Crow had the men that he enslaved on his land killed before building the home where their living quarters once stood. It's believed he killed the men that he enslaved on his land because his wife had had a child with one of these men. The land also sits across the street from where an axe murder and suicide had taken place in 1974. But Steven didn't get any of this history I just told you. Instead, the owner of the home told Steven that no one lived in the house for more than a year. She shared that one past tenant thought their father's ghost was haunting the house, while another left in the middle of the night and wouldn't come back to collect his stuff. After finding this out from the owner, it wasn't long before they also left this home for good. The Lachance family were having a pretty normal Monday night in the house. The boys were playing downstairs while Steven and his daughter were upstairs. In a quick change of the night, all of the house's doors began to slam open and shut. All of the lights began to flicker, accompanied by the loud, upsetting sound of a man screaming. But this time, Steven could also hear his daughter screaming from behind her bedroom door. Steven ran to his daughter's door to try to help her out, but the door wouldn't open. Then he felt the dark entity standing behind him. Steven yelled out in a pure moment of desperation, "God help me," and the house went quiet, long enough for the Lachance family to run from the home. As they ran from the home, they could see this dark figure flying through the house, trying to find the family. His daughter later shared that night, when she was locked in the bedroom, she could hear a bunch of just screaming around her, and she didn't know what to do. Steven's children left that night, never to return to the house. But Steven had to return to the house to collect their belongings, and when he did return, he could feel the entity and experience the lights turning on and off, and doors slamming, and the screams as well. After officially getting their belongings out of the home, Steven contacted paranormal investigators and the Catholic Church to come and investigate the home. Multiple investigators, including the Warrens and the church, came to the conclusion that this home had a demonic attachment to it. As for the owner of the home, when Steven told her they were moving out of the home, she replied, "Some people are meant to live in an old home like that, and some people aren't. I never thought you were the old home type." After the Lachance family moved out, the home had a hard time keeping tenants. Many of them did not want to talk about why they left the home, but one woman in particular named Helen seemed to get the worst of it. Helen would hear breathing close by her and footsteps throughout the home when she was alone, as well as footsteps upstairs when she was downstairs. Her belongings moved right in front of her, light bulbs would die, and the gutters would catch on fire. Her granddaughter's dolls would be destroyed, and her grandson was pushed down the stairs. One night, while alone, police responded to a suicide call coming from the house, and the most upsetting of all, a kitten that she had bought for her granddaughter was killed in the home while it was upstairs alone. Finding and talking to Helen was actually what inspired Steven to not just leave what happened to him in this home in the past, but to write what he and Helen had gone through at this house. Steven did this by publishing a book about it titled The Uninvited, the true story of the Union Screaming House. After the book, he went on numerous TV shows like A Haunting and Shock Docs. He then went on to write a sequel in 2014 named Blessed Are the Wicked, which goes into how this haunting affected him and his children after they left the home. It also went into the haunting of other tenants in the home. So, what do you think of this haunting? Would you live in a house like this, or have you lived in a house like this? I'd love to hear more about what you think about this episode and this podcast wherever you are listening to Misty Mysteries right now, or on my podcast social media available in the episode description. As for this episode, I'm all about out of material, so I will see you next time for more ghostly spooks and chilling crimes.